Coming up on Finding G-Spots, we take to the air again. This time we're flying from Canberra to Perth via Melbourne on Virgin Business Class. Welcome back everyone. Well, it's been a little while since I've done a flight review. I've been a little bit behind with my reviews, but this is from the flight I did late last year, flying back from Canberra to Perth. And we went via Melbourne. We went with Virgin, and I had a great time in Canberra. You can see a little bit of the footage here. And anyway, this is from our flight back, which went via Melbourne. Unfortunately, Virgin doesn't do direct flights from Canberra to Perth, but I'll talk more about that later. So the first leg of the flight is to Melbourne, and it's just over 1 hour flight time. And let's start at the Canberra Airport. And this review will be a mixture of the voiceover and me in real time. I've got a little bit to say here. At the Canberra Airport. Now I had quite an early flight. I think the flight went at roughly 7 o'clock and I got to the airport pretty much just after 5 o'clock and had a walk around and try to access the Virgin Lounge, which you can join me now in real time and I'll explain. So I'm very early and I don't think the Virgin Lounge is open for domestic flights leaving this early from Canberra. So this actually is up in the international area, and yeah, well, the Virgin Lounge is supposedly up here somewhere, so that's a big negative. So no such luck with using the lounge facilities here in Canberra if you fly Virgin. On the positive side, the flight seems to be on time. We're at gate 8 and we're boarding at 6:40. I think if I ever did this flight again, I would choose a later flight, but I don't know whether I would be able to access the lounge in that case. Anyway, well, I'll talk more about that later. Just out of interest, I look for the Qantas Lounge. The Qantas Lounge is on the other side. I might have a sticky beak and have a look and see if they have a domestic one that's open if you're flying from Canberra. Looks like Qantas is the superior airline here at Canberra. They actually do have a lounge. Sadly, the Virgin one is closed, so that's a bit of a shame, but it's just the way it is here. Last time I flew here from Canberra was actually with Qantas. I can't for the life of me remember. It was 4 years ago. It was during the pandemic, which is probably why I can't remember, because that's a bit of a blur. But I did take Qantas then. But I suspect I didn't use the lounge, and possibly the airport's changed since then. You know, 4 years can be a long time, as you know. I'm just taking the opportunity to charge my headphones. I didn't get much chance to do it this morning, but there are some spots where you can charge and sit down. It looks like there is a bar open at this time, so if you wanted to do that, you could. Other than that, the airport is reasonably quiet. I guess most travellers with Virgin who fly business class realise that there's no lounge here, and they probably just come a little bit later on. But anyway, if you're not flying business, you're just flying economy, well, there is places where you can get food and drink here if you wanted to. Reasonably small airport, as you can see. So I did this flight in early spring last year, and it turned out to be an absolutely beautiful morning. Really lovely weather for flying. Anyway, it was time to board, so we're flying today on a Boeing 737-800. There's 8 business class seats at the front, and I was in an aisle seat again. I wanted to do this whole trip in an aisle seat just to see what the difference was. And I definitely, if I can avoid it, I won't be doing that in the future. I think a window seat is much better. Or just board last. Anyway, onto the food here. Now, I didn't particularly like this food. Normally, I don't mind Virgin's food offerings, but this is probably one of the worst offerings that I've had from them in recent memory. It was some sort of frittata, sort of quiche thing, a cake I didn't like. Yeah, it wasn't the best food, but never mind, that sometimes happens. Anyway, onto the flight, and there we were, landing in Melbourne in just over 1 hour. And because we had such a short stopover in Melbourne, I wasn't able to use the lounge facilities either in Melbourne. So that whole business class experience was a little bit of a fizzer, but I will talk more about alternatives to that later on in the video. Anyway, now we're moving on to our second leg, back to my home state of Western Australia. It's just over 4 hours to fly there. Once again, we're on the Boeing 737-800, and once again I was in an aisle seat, this time on the right hand side of the plane. The legroom was actually pretty good, and I don't mind the seats there in Virgin. They're pretty good for domestic business class. Now, I did film the toilets, which I do sometimes, just to see if the standard is any good, and I'm happy to say the toilets were of a good standard, certainly on this flight anyway. Now onto the meal. It was marginally better this leg. There was sort of a breakfast option again, as you can see there, some beans and another sort of frittata. The flight was pretty uneventful, and there we were landing and back home in Perth, or at least to my home state. And that is the flight from Canberra all the way back to Perth. Now before I get on and rate this, I would say if you're going to do this particular leg, my advice would be take a later flight, because the lounge then in the Virgin Lounge may be open in Canberra. Also, maybe opt for a longer stopover in Melbourne so that you've got time to utilise the facilities there, but obviously that will depend upon your time. Failing that, go Qantas and then do it as a direct flight. I certainly enjoyed it, and if you're time poor and you need to do the trip quickly, you can save yourself a few hours if you just fly direct. So, in this instance, I think Qantas do have the superior product. Although, when I did check prices, they're also a lot more expensive. So I know not everyone can afford business class, but even if you do, it does cost quite a bit to do it with Qantas. That's just the way it is at the moment with this particular flight in Australia. Anyway, let's get on and rate this. I'm rating it as the overall flight for 2 legs. Alright, let's start off with the lounge. I'm giving it 0 out of 5, simply because it was closed in Canberra, which I don't think is good enough, and I couldn't even utilise it in Melbourne, so all around very disappointing. The flight, I'm happy to say I can't really complain. They were both on time, no real turbulence to speak of, pretty smooth flight. So I guess I'm giving it 4.5 out of 5. Okay, turning to the meal service, this was easily the worst that I've experienced on Virgin Business Class in all my flights that I can recall. I don't know what went wrong. I've had a good run up until now, so I suppose I was due for a bad flight. So yeah, not the best. 3 out of 5. Moving on to the seats. Well, they're not bad. The Virgin Business Class seats are pretty much what you can expect on a domestic flight in Australia if you take business class. However, being in the aisle was not ideal, so that experiment I would say was a big failure, and I'll be sticking to the window seat if I can in future. Otherwise, make sure you board last so you don't have all the people banging into you. So yeah, 3.5 out of 5 this time. To staff, I'd probably say 4 out of 5. They're usually pretty good, no real complaints on this flight. So finally, overall, pretty average flight. I'd give it 3 out of 5, even that's stretching a little bit. Even though some elements were okay, yeah, it just wasn't a great flight overall. The whole package was just a bit of a fizzer. Now, if you've been following my channel and you've seen the flight reviews that I've done, you can go to the playlist there, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, and you can have a look at the flight reviews I've done. You'll know that I've had a lot of great flights recently. So, I guess I was due for a pretty ordinary flight. But anyway, that wraps it up for today's review. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'm sure my next business class flight will be wonderful. Alright, you guys take care out there, and we'll see you very soon with more on Finding G-Spots. Bye for now.